Chapter 25. In contrast to the noisy taverns and restaurants they had passed so far, the interior of the ryokan was an oasis of calm and quiet. Holt, Will, and Alice found themselves in a large entry room, walls and floor finished in a polished timber. The sweet smell of beeswax hung in the air, evidence of constant polishing. It was overlaid by a mixture of incense and scented wood smoke, the latter from a fireplace set against one side wall, where a log fire sent a warm glow through the room. This subdued lighting was augmented by several hanging lanterns, each consisting of a candle burning inside a paper globe. Opposite the fireplace, and set in symmetry to it, a small raised pond sent reflections of light ribboning across the walls. The decor of the room was sparse but elegant. A large table faced them, with two beautifully lacquered boxes, one at either end, and a heavy journal in the centre. Writing implements were arranged neatly beside the journal. Behind it was a framed wall painting, not a picture, but a large Nihon-Ja ideogram. To the left, a timber staircase ascended to the next level, and a wooden-railed gallery ran around four sides of the open space above them. Holt, glancing round, assumed that access to the guest rooms led off from this gallery. There was a single step in front of them, so that the main area of the room was slightly higher than the entry. Will went to step onto the raised area and approach the table, but Alice had noticed several pairs of sandals ranged along the lower part of the floor. She recalled an item from George's background notes on Nihon-Ja customs and stopped him with a hand on his arm. "Just a moment, Will," she said. "Your boots." "What about them?" he asked, but Holt had noticed the discarded sandals and a shelf of soft slippers set to one side. "Take them off," he said. "It's a Nihon-Ja custom," Alice explained. "They don't wear boots inside." Holt was already stripping off his boots and placing them against the shelf. He looked appreciatively at the polished wood floor, the colour of dark honey in the fire and lantern light. "With floors like these, I'm not surprised," he said. Will and Alice followed suit. They stepped up onto the raised platform and selected slippers. They all seemed to be the same size, but they were a simple slip-over style, with a matting sole and a soft felt band that stretched over the instep of the foot to hold them in place. "Just as well Horace isn't here," Will said. The young warrior's big feet would have overhung the compact slippers. The others smiled at the thought. Then, as if he had been waiting for them to don the slippers, a man emerged from a curtained doorway behind the long table. He stopped and bowed. The three of them approached the table and bowed in return. It seemed a lot of bowing went on in this country, Will thought. "How may I serve you?" the man said. His voice was soft and slightly sibilant. Alice glanced at Holt. The man had spoken in the common tongue, and she assumed that Holt would conduct the conversation with him. He nodded briefly to her. "We would like rooms," he said, "for 2 nights, possibly 3. "Of course. That will not be a problem. You are from the foreign ship that entered the harbour today." Holt nodded, and the man opened the large book on the table. He picked up what Will had assumed to be a pen, but now saw was a fine brush. He dipped it in an inkwell made from polished blackwood and made 2 neat entries in the book, which was obviously the register of rooms available. "Did you want to dine?" he asked. "There is a dining room downstairs, or we can serve your meal in one of the rooms." "I think in the room upstairs," Holt said. He indicated Will. "My assistant and I will take one room, and the lady will have the other. You can serve the meal in our room." The man bowed slightly. "As you wish. Is there anything else, or shall I show you to your rooms now?" Holt exchanged a quick glance with Alice. He wondered if the man already suspected the reason behind their visit. After all, this was where George had spent several nights before he left Iwanai. He came to a decision and leaned forward, lowering his voice a little. "We were told that we might find a friend here," he began. "A man by the name of Atsu. He came—" He was interrupted by the sound of the door slamming back on its hinges behind them. They all turned as two senshi strode into the inn, their boots ringing loud on the wooden floor. Contemptuously, they ignored the slippers and stepped, hard-shod, onto the raised inner platform. One, obviously the leader, was a pace ahead of the other. The innkeeper's eyes flickered briefly with annoyance, but he quickly recovered and bowed to the newcomers, his hands tucked inside his sleeves. "Bow," Holt muttered to his companions. He'd felt a momentary surge of apprehension, wondering whether the innkeeper might inform the senshi that they were inquiring about Atsu. But it was obvious that the man was no friend to Arasaka's soldiers. The senshi made a derisive noise in his throat as they bowed deeply to him. He disdained to return the compliment, then turned and fired off a stream of rapid Nihon-Jan at the innkeeper. Will heard the word gajin used several times. He glanced at Alice and saw she was frowning slightly as she tried to keep pace with the conversation. The innkeeper replied courteously, withdrawing a hand from the sleeve of his robe to indicate his guests with a graceful gesture. The senshi turned to them. Singling out Holt as the leader, he stepped closer to him, too close for politeness, and stood, feet apart and hands on hips, studying him. Will noted the symbol on the breast of his robe, a red owl. They had learned that this was the mark of Arasaka's clan, although Will felt they could also be identified by their overbearing, arrogant manner. Holt, who could appear deceptively obsequious if the occasion demanded it, dropped his eyes from the direct, challenging gaze of the senshi. The man grunted again, seeing the simple action as an act of weakness. "Gajun!" he said abruptly, jabbing a forefinger at each of them in quick succession. "From the Gajin ship!" Holt inclined his head. "That is correct, lord," he said. He was sure the senshi was anything but a lord, but it would do no harm to call him that. "Uncover your face in front of a senshi," the man ordered. He reached forward and slapped the cowl of Holt's cloak back from his face with the back of his hand. Will drew a sharp breath, sure that Holt would react explosively to the insult. But the bearded ranger merely bowed his head again. The hand had made no contact with his face, merely catching the brim of the cowl and knocking it back. The senshi nodded to himself in satisfaction, then turned to Alice and Will. "You and you, the same!" They pushed back their cowls. Alice bowed as she did so, and Will followed suit, glad that his lowered head would mask the anger that he knew was showing in his eyes. When he had recovered his equanimity, he straightened again. "Why are you here?" The senshi had turned his attention back to Holt. "We are here to trade in precious stones," Holt replied. It was the answer Gundar had given earlier in the day to the harbour official. Trading in precious stones explained the lack of large cargo space on board the ship, and went some way towards explaining their speedy lines. A ship with a cargo of jewels would need to be fast after all. But the senshi reacted angrily to his answer, stepping even closer to shout in his face. "No, no, no! Why are you here?" He stamped his foot, scuffing a mark into the soft polish, and pointed at the floor. "Why in this ryokan?" The innkeeper intervened with an explanation in Nihon-Jan. His voice was low and respectful, and he kept his gaze lowered, avoiding eye contact with the angry senshi. The warrior listened to the explanation, then turned his gaze on the three Araluens and made a comment to his comrade. They both laughed, and then, with a contemptuous gesture, the senshi indicated that he had no further interest in the foreigners. The two men turned and stumped out of the ryokan, slamming the door shut behind them. "And what was that all about?" Will asked. He had addressed the question to Alice, but it was the innkeeper who answered. I told them you had come for the baths. The ryokan is built over a hot spring. The senshi check on the movements of all foreigners in the town. They enjoy showing how important they are. Someone must have seen you arriving here and reported it. There are informers everywhere these days, he added sadly. That could make travelling north a little difficult, Holt said thoughtfully, and the innkeeper nodded agreement. It won't be easy. Actually, after so long at sea, a hot bath sounds like a good idea, Holt said. On the journey, with fresh water a premium, they had been forced to use seawater for bathing. And what was Mr. Smiley-Face's closing sally? Will asked. It seemed to put them both in such a good mood. He said, judging by the way we smell, we need a bath, Alice replied. Will raised an eyebrow at the insult, but Holt uttered a short laugh. If it wasn't so true, I might be insulted, he said. He turned to the innkeeper. Perhaps we might use the baths first, then eat, he suggested. The innkeeper nodded. I'll show you the way, he said. And, while you're relaxing, I'll send a messenger to see if Atsu is still in Iwanai. He comes and goes. Before she left the others to go to the women's bath area, Alice gave them careful instructions. The hot baths themselves were not for washing. They were for soaking and relaxing. Accordingly, they washed and rinsed off in an annex, scooping hot water from tubs and pouring it over themselves, and then plunged into the near-scalding water of the bath. At first, it was agony, but Will gradually became accustomed to the heat and felt it soothing the aches and pains of several weeks standing braced on a heaving, uncertain deck and sleeping on hard planks. Reluctantly, he finally emerged, dried himself, and wrapped himself in a soft robe the ryokan provided. Alice was waiting for them when he and Holt returned to their room. In the centre of the room, a low table, barely 30 centimetres from the floor, had been placed in position. It was laden with bowls and plates and small candle-fired food warmers. Will looked around hopefully for a chair, but, in keeping with the minimalist decor of the ryokan, there were none available. Alice sat, resting on her heels, legs folded under her at the table. Holt groaned softly. I was afraid of this, he said. I suppose we have to sleep on the floor too. He'd noticed earlier that there were no beds in the room. When he'd inquired, the innkeeper had shown them thick mattresses stored behind one of the sliding screens that masked a closet. Will grinned at him as he helped himself to a skewer of grilled chicken, covered in a delicious salty dark sauce. You've been sleeping on the ground for years when we camp, he said. When did you become so fussy? When we camp, Holt replied. We're out in the open. I accept that I have to sleep on the ground when I am in a forest or a meadow. But this is a room, and this is a floor. When I'm indoors, I prefer to sleep in a bed. He removed the lid from a polished wood bowl and eyed the steaming broth inside. Looking round, he could see no sign of a spoon, so he drank directly from the bowl. This is actually very good, he said. Alice was helping herself to another dish, a broth of noodles heavily laced with shredded pork. She looked puzzled at the 2 wooden sticks that seemed to be the only implements, then held the bowl close to her mouth and shoveled some of the noodles and pork in with the sticks, slurping in a highly unladylike fashion. You know, I rather hope Atsu doesn't show up in too much of a hurry. I could take a few more days of this, she said. Holt shifted position for the 3rd time in 30 seconds, easing the strain in his thighs by sitting sidelong on one buttock. Tell that to my poor old aching knees, he said.